It was a cold night on April 18th, 2021, around 7:40 in the evening, when Jake Morrison found himself driving down a lonely stretch of Interstate 45 just outside of Conroe, Texas. Jake had spent the entire day at a racing event in Houston, and now he was heading back home to Dallas, a long drive through some of the most desolate parts of East Texas. His truck was hauling a massive toy hauler trailer behind it, and he was cruising at a steady 60 miles per hour, headlights cutting through the thick darkness that seemed to swallow everything around him. The highway was empty, as it usually was at this hour, with nothing but pine forests stretching endlessly on either side. Jake had made this drive countless times before, but something about tonight felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a heaviness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself he was just tired from the long day. But then, without any warning whatsoever, his headlights illuminated something that made his blood run cold. Standing right in the middle of the highway, directly in his path, was a small figure, one that looked disturbingly like a child. The figure was wearing a blue hooded jacket, and from what Jake could see in those few terrifying seconds, it appeared to be trying to cross the highway, completely oblivious to the massive truck, barreling toward it at high speed. Jake's mind raced as fast as his truck was moving. He was traveling at 60 miles per hour, towing several tons of equipment behind him, and there was absolutely no way he could stop in time. If he slammed on the brakes now, the trailer would jackknife, sending his entire rig spinning out of control and likely causing a catastrophic accident that could kill him and anyone else unlucky enough to be on this stretch of highway. If he swerved to avoid the figure, the same deadly result would occur. The physics of heavy hauling left him with virtually no safe options. His mother, who had decided to accompany him on this trip back from Houston, sat frozen in the passenger seat, her hand gripping the door handle so tight, her knuckles had turned white. Time seemed to slow down. As Jake made the only decision he could, he kept his truck steady, his hands locked on the steering wheel, praying that somehow, someway, this would end without tragedy. The figure grew larger in his windshield, with each passing millisecond, and Jake could now see more details that only added to his terror. The child, if it was indeed a child, seemed to be moving in a strange, almost mechanical way, its movements not quite natural, not quite human. As the truck closed the final distance, Jake held his breath and braced for impact. But then, at the very last possible second, his truck passed by the figure, missing it by mere inches. Jake could have sworn he felt the presence of something right next to his vehicle, could have sworn he heard something scrape against the side of his trailer. But when he checked his mirrors, there was nothing there. The highway behind him was completely empty, as if the figure had simply vanished into thin air. Jake's heart was pounding so hard, he thought it might burst out of his chest. His hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and he could feel cold sweat dripping down his back, despite the cool Texas night air. His mother immediately grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her voice trembling, as she tried to explain what they had just witnessed to the emergency dispatcher. "There's a child on Interstate 45, near mile marker 87, just standing in the middle of the highway," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "My son almost hit them. They're wearing a blue jacket. Please, you have to send someone right away." before someone else comes along and doesn't see them in time. The dispatcher on the other end of the line assured them that patrol units were being dispatched immediately to the location. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong about what he had just seen. The way the figure had moved, the way it had simply disappeared from his mirrors, none of it made sense. He kept glancing at his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there again, in the middle of the highway, but there was nothing but empty asphalt and darkness. As they continued driving, Jake's mind raced with questions. What was a child doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night? The nearest town was at least 15 miles away, and there were no houses, no rest stops, nothing that would explain the presence of a child on this desolate stretch of highway. His mother tried to calm him down, telling him that the police would handle it, that they had done everything they could by reporting it. But Jake couldn't let it go. The image of that small figure in the blue jacket was burned into his mind, and he needed to know that whoever it was had been found safe. About 45 minutes later, as Jake pulled into a truck stop near Huntsville, to calm his nerves with some coffee, he decided to call the police again. He couldn't stop thinking about that figure, and he wanted to make sure that help had arrived in time. When he got through to the dispatcher, he offered to send them the dashcam footage from his truck. He had a high-quality camera mounted on his dashboard that captured everything that happened on the road. But before he could even finish his sentence, the dispatcher interrupted him with news that should have brought him relief. "We found the child, sir," the dispatcher said, in a calm, professional voice. "Our officers swept the area and located a young boy matching your description. He's been safely returned to his family. Thank you for reporting it." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him. His mother, who had been listening anxiously, let out a long breath and squeezed his hand. They had done the right thing by calling it in, and because of their quick action, a child was safe. Jake posted about the experience on Facebook later that night, writing about how terrified he had been, but how grateful he was that everything had worked out okay. He wrote about the importance of staying alert on dark highways, and how thankful he was to the Texas police for their quick response. His post got hundreds of reactions and shares, with other truck drivers commenting about their own close calls on lonely highways. For a brief moment, Jake thought he could put this unsettling experience behind him and chalk it up to just another weird night on the road. But that moment of peace wouldn't last long. Something much stranger was about to unfold, something that would turn this already bizarre incident into something far more sinister and unexplainable. The next morning, Jake decided to upload the dashcam video to YouTube, hoping to share his harrowing experience with a wider audience and perhaps raise awareness about highway safety. The video quickly gained traction, racking up thousands of views. Within just a few hours, people were fascinated and disturbed by the footage, many commenting about how lucky Jake had been to avoid hitting the figure. But then, something completely unexpected happened. The Texas Department of Public Safety issued an official statement regarding the incident, and what they said contradicted everything Jake had been told the night before. According to their official report, officers had indeed responded to the call and conducted an extensive search of the area around mile marker 87 on Interstate 45. They had used multiple patrol vehicles, search dogs, and even a helicopter equipped with thermal imaging. The search had continued for nearly 8 hours, going well past 3 in the morning, covering not just the highway, but also the surrounding forests and rural areas. But despite their thorough and exhaustive efforts, they had found absolutely no trace of any child in the area. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there, nothing. The official statement read, "Multiple units responded to the reported sighting and conducted a comprehensive search of the location and surrounding area. However, no child was located, and the search was eventually suspended. We take all reports seriously and want to assure the public that a thorough investigation was conducted." Jake read the statement 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. Someone from the police department had definitely told him that a child had been found and returned home. He had heard it with his own ears. His mother had heard it too. But now, the official story was completely different. What was going on? Had there been a terrible miscommunication? Had the dispatcher simply told him what he wanted to hear, to calm him down? Or was something far more disturbing at play? As Jake's video continued to spread across social media, conspiracy theories and speculation began to flood in from every direction. Some people suggested that the figure Jake had seen wasn't a child at all, but something else entirely. Perhaps a paranormal entity or some kind of unexplained phenomenon that had manifested on that lonely stretch of Texas highway. Others theorized that there had indeed been a child, but that someone had taken them before the police arrived, spiriting them away into the darkness for reasons too terrible to contemplate. A few commenters even suggested that the Texas police were covering something up, though what they might be hiding and why remained unclear. Jake tried to make sense of it all, but every possible explanation seemed to lead to more questions. If the police never found anyone, then where did the figure go? Jake had passed within inches of it. It was real. It was there. He had seen it with his own eyes, and his dashcam had captured it on video. But how could a child simply vanish in the middle of an empty highway with nowhere to hide? The nearest tree line was at least 50 yards away from where the figure had been standing, and Jake had checked his mirrors immediately after passing. There was no way anyone, especially a small child, could have covered that distance in the few seconds it took him to look back. Some investigators, who later analyzed the footage, pointed out something that Jake hadn't noticed in his moment of panic. The figure's movements seemed odd, almost unnatural. The way it stood, so perfectly still, then moved, then vanished. It didn't quite match normal human behavior. especially not that of a frightened child, standing in the path of an oncoming truck. But if it wasn't a child, then what was it? And why would it choose to appear on this particular stretch of highway, in front of this particular truck, on this particular night? While Jake's incident remained unsolved and unexplained, it wasn't the only disturbing highway encounter that year. Just a few weeks later, on May 8th, 2021, something equally terrifying happened hundreds of miles away in Kent County, Michigan. A young woman named Sarah Martinez and her group of friends were driving home around 2:30 in the morning after a night out in Grand Rapids. They were heading east on Packer Drive Northeast, a winding road that runs alongside the Grand River in the small community of Belmont. The area is known for its quiet, rural charm during the day, but at night, especially in the early morning hours, it becomes something else entirely. A maze of dark roads, dense forests, and the ever-present sound of the river rushing by in the darkness. Sarah was in the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone, when one of her friends in the back suddenly shouted for them to stop. "What the hell is that?" her friend screamed, pointing at something ahead on the road. The driver slammed on the brakes, and they all stared in horror at what appeared to be a person crawling across the pavement. The figure was moving in a disturbing, unnatural way, dragging itself across the road like something out of a nightmare. Sarah immediately grabbed her phone and started recording. They could see that whoever this was, they were completely soaked, water dripping off them and pooling on the asphalt. The temperature that night was barely 48 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that being soaking wet could lead to hypothermia in a matter of minutes. After a moment of shocked silence, the group made a decision. They had to go back and check on this person, even though every instinct in their bodies was screaming at them to drive away as fast as they could. As they circled back, their headlights revealed a scene that was both heartbreaking and terrifying. It was a young woman, probably in her late 20s or early 30s, sitting right in the middle of the road. Her clothes were completely drenched, and she appeared to be either waving at them or hitting herself in the head. It was impossible to tell which. Her movements were erratic, confused, nothing like how a person in full control of their senses would behave. Sarah and her friends exchanged nervous glances. This woman clearly needed help, but there was also a very real possibility that this was some kind of setup for a robbery, or worse, they had all heard the stories. People faking emergencies on dark roads to prey on anyone who stopped to help. The group decided to make one more pass to see if the situation was genuine or if something more sinister was happening. This time, when their headlights swept across the scene, they saw that the woman had collapsed completely, lying motionless on the cold pavement. That's when Sarah and her friends realized Whatever was happening here, this woman was in genuine danger and needed immediate medical attention. But they also weren't stupid. They weren't going to get out of their car in the middle of the night on a deserted road, no matter how dire the situation seemed. Sarah immediately dialed 911 while the driver kept the engine running, ready to speed away if needed. She explained the situation to the dispatcher, describing the woman's condition and their exact location on Packer Drive. The dispatcher assured them help was on the way and told them to stay inside the vehicle until officers arrived. Within minutes, they heard sirens in the distance. The Kent County Sheriff's deputies arrived first, followed quickly by an ambulance. The paramedics carefully approached the woman and began assessing her condition. She was severely hypothermic, barely conscious, and showing signs of significant trauma. After the paramedics took the woman to Spectrum Health Butterworth Hospital in Grand Rapids, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about what they had witnessed. Something about the whole situation just didn't add up. A few hours later, after the sun had come up, Sarah decided to drive back to the spot where they had found the woman. In the daylight, she could see things that had been hidden by the darkness the night before. The pavement where the woman had been lying was still wet, a dark stain on the road, showing just how soaked she had been. But what really caught Sarah's attention was what she found when she walked down to the riverbank. There were deep gouges in the muddy slope leading down to the Grand River, marks that looked like someone had clawed their way up from the water. The marks were fresh, made within the last few hours, and they told a terrifying story. This woman hadn't just gotten wet from rain or fallen into a shallow puddle. She had been in the river itself, in the cold, fast-moving water of the Grand River, and she had fought her way back to shore, climbing up the steep embankment in the dark, before collapsing on the road. Sarah took photos of everything she saw and shared them in the local Belmont community Facebook group, asking if anyone knew who this woman was or what might have happened to her. The responses she received were both informative and disturbing. Several people said they had seen the same woman earlier that evening, hours before Sarah and her friends found her, and her behavior had been extremely strange even then. One resident wrote that they saw the woman walking through their neighborhood around 10:15 p.m., moving in an aimless, confused manner. When they asked if she needed help, she simply said, "No," and continued wandering. Another person reported something even more unsettling. The woman had walked directly into their home, uninvited, calling out, "Hello, hello, hello," before wandering through their house, into their backyard, and leaving just as suddenly as she had arrived. As the Michigan State Police investigated the incident, the woman's identity was finally established, and the story became even more disturbing and tragic. Her name was Mei Chen, a 28-year-old graduate student at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. But here's the part that made everyone's blood run cold. Mei had been reported missing from Kalamazoo 2 days earlier, on May 16th. Kalamazoo is over 60 miles away from Belmont, and May had no connection to the area, no reason to be there, and according to doctors treating her at the hospital, she had absolutely no memory of driving to Belmont or how she ended up in the Grand River. In the days before she disappeared, May had told several of her friends something deeply concerning. She believed someone was stalking her. She felt watched, had noticed the same vehicle following her multiple times, and had become increasingly paranoid and anxious. Her friends urged her to report it to campus police. She did file a report, but nothing came of it. No evidence of a stalker, no threats, nothing. But May's fear was very real, and it was affecting her daily life. When she disappeared on May 16th, her friends feared the worst, that this stalker, real or imagined, had finally made their move. But the truth, as investigators slowly pieced it together, was potentially even more disturbing than a simple kidnapping. May's car was found parked behind a house near the Grand River in Belmont. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing to suggest anyone else had been involved. Traffic camera footage from the route between Kalamazoo and Belmont showed May driving alone, making the entire journey by herself, apparently of her own free will. But if she drove there herself, why? And how did she end up in the river? As May slowly recovered in the hospital, psychiatrists and psychologists began to piece together what might have happened during those missing 48 hours. The answer they arrived at was both fascinating and terrifying. From a medical perspective, they believed May had experienced something called a dissociative fugue state, a rare, poorly understood psychological condition that can cause a person to lose their sense of identity and engage in purposeful travel or wandering, often with no memory of how or why. A dissociative fugue is usually triggered by extreme stress or trauma, can last for hours, days, sometimes even months. During a fugue state, a person might appear completely normal to outside observers. They can drive, make decisions, interact with people, but they're essentially operating on autopilot. Their conscious mind shut down as a defense mechanism against overwhelming psychological stress. In May's case, the constant fear and anxiety of feeling stalked, whether the stalker was real or a creation of her stressed mind, had pushed her to a breaking point. The stress triggered the fugue, causing her to get into her car and drive, not knowing where, not knowing why, her mind simply seeking escape from the unbearable anxiety she had been living with. For 2 days, she wandered, her car taking her north to Belmont, for reasons that not even she could explain. Somehow, she ended up near the Grand River, and somehow, and this is the part that still haunts investigators, she ended up in the water itself. Whether she fell accidentally, whether she walked in deliberately in her confused state, or whether something else happened entirely, remains unknown. What is known is that at some point, perhaps when the cold water shocked her system, May began to emerge from her fugue state. Her survival instincts kicked in. She fought her way to the surface, swam toward the shore, and clawed her way up the muddy embankment. But even after reaching the road, she was still partially trapped in that dissociative state, which explains her strange, confused behavior. When Sarah and her friends found her, while May's story had a relatively hopeful ending, she survived and eventually made a full recovery. Not all disturbing highway encounters end with such fortune. To understand just how dangerous these random road encounters can be, we need to go back a few years, to October 2016, to an incident that took place in Sheffield, England, an event that sparked a worldwide phenomenon and eventually reached American shores, with terrifying consequences. On October 12, 2016, the Morrison family, Robert, his wife Jennifer, and their 2 teenage daughters, were driving home from a local pub where they had enjoyed a pleasant dinner together. It was just past midnight, and the roads in their rural corner of Sheffield were predictably empty. They were actually being extra cautious because of recent reports of robbery activity in the area, keeping their doors locked, staying alert for anything suspicious. But nothing could have prepared them for what happened next as Robert rounded a corner onto a narrow road called Grange Mill Lane. A figure suddenly burst from the shadows at the side of the road and stepped directly into their path, forcing Robert to slam on the brakes. The figure was wearing a full clown costume, the whole terrifying package, the white face, the grotesque smile, the colorful outfit. But this wasn't some children's entertainer walking home from a birthday party. The clown's costume was dirty, and there was something deeply, unnervingly wrong about the way it moved. The clown stood there in the headlights, illuminated like an actor on a stage, and began waving at the car in slow, deliberate motions, movements clearly meant to be disturbing. Rather than friendly, Jennifer Morrison immediately locked all the doors and pulled out her phone to call the police, while their daughters in the back seat began to scream. Robert tried to reverse the car, to back away, but the road was narrow, flanked by stone walls on both sides. There wasn't much room to maneuver, and that's when the clown started running toward them at full speed. What the Morrison family didn't know was that their terrifying encounter was part of a much larger and much more disturbing trend. Just 3 days before their incident, on October 9th, 2016, a man named Simon Chineri had been walking through Blackburn Town Center when he was suddenly attacked by someone dressed as a clown, armed with a knife. The attacker slashed Simon's right hand multiple times, causing severe, permanent nerve damage, leaving him with limited use of his hand for the rest of his life. The attack was random, unprovoked, and completely motiveless. The attacker didn't try to rob him, didn't demand anything. He just attacked him, laughed, and ran away. When video of the attack went viral on social media, something unsettling happened. Instead of being horrified, thousands of people across the UK began to treat it like some twisted challenge, a sick kind of game. Within days, police departments across Britain were receiving dozens of reports every single day of people dressed as clowns, threatening, chasing, and in some cases assaulting random strangers. But the phenomenon didn't stay in the UK. By late October 2016, it had crossed the ocean and reached the United States with terrifying speed. In Pennsylvania, a man dressed as a clown was arrested after attempting to lure children into the woods. In Ohio, several schools were forced into lockdown after clowns were spotted on their campuses. In South Carolina, a creepy clown was seen trying to lure kids into the woods with money, sparking a massive police manhunt. In Kentucky, clowns were seen standing on the side of highways, waving at passing cars. In the middle of the night, the situation became so serious that major retailers like Target and Walmart stopped selling clown costumes entirely. School districts sent warnings to parents. Police departments issued statements advising people to call 911 immediately if they encountered anyone dressed as a clown, behaving suspiciously. And in some cities, the fear became so intense that people formed vigilante groups, patrolling their neighborhoods at night, armed with baseball bats, determined to protect their communities from these threatening figures. During that same period of the 2016 clown craze, something far more terrifying was happening on the highways of Texas, a reminder that these encounters weren't just creepy, they could turn deadly. In an instant, on a dark stretch of State Highway 71, just outside Austin, Texas, several motorists began reporting a lone clown standing in the middle of the road, forcing cars to stop. But this wasn't a prank. This wasn't a costume gone too far. This clown was armed and was using the disguise to commit real robberies. The first incident happened on October 15th, 2016, when a young couple, David and Maria Gonzalez, were driving home from a late dinner in Austin around 11:30 p.m. as they passed through a lonely, isolated stretch of highway surrounded by farmland and complete darkness. A clown suddenly appeared in their headlights, standing motionless with its arms spread wide. David slammed the brakes, stopping just feet away before either of them could understand what was happening. The clown pulled out a gun and walked toward the driver's window, gesturing for David to roll it down. Thinking fast, David threw the car into reverse and floored it. The clown suddenly sprinted after them, running at an unnatural speed, and fired 2 shots at their vehicle. One bullet shattered the rear windshield, missing Maria's head by inches and embedding itself in the front dashboard. Glass exploded everywhere. Maria screamed, and David kept driving in reverse for nearly a quarter mile before he finally spun the car around. They called 911 immediately. When police arrived, they found bullet casings and footprints, but the clown had vanished into the night. And over the next 2 weeks, at least 4 more incidents, just like this one, were reported on Texas highways, always late at night, always on isolated stretches of road, always involving a clown trying to stop vehicles. ***. Now we move to a completely different type of highway horror, one that occurred on June 2nd, 2018, in Foley, Alabama. This incident shows that sometimes the most disturbing things on highways aren't supernatural or criminal, but the tragic results of poor human judgment and its devastating consequences. Officer Marcus Thompson of the Foley Police Department was driving back to the station after completing his evening patrol shift. It was around 11:45 p.m. Highway 59 was mostly empty, with only the occasional car or truck passing by. Marcus was tired, looking forward to getting home to his family, when suddenly, the vehicle in front of him swerved dramatically into the adjacent lane. Marcus went on alert, assuming there must be debris or an animal in the road. But what he saw as he approached made his blood run cold. Lying horizontally across the southbound lanes was what appeared to be a body, a young woman in a blue shirt, spread-eagled on the pavement, completely motionless. Marcus's first thought: he had stumbled upon a crime scene, perhaps a hit-and-run victim, or someone who had been murdered and left on the highway. He immediately called for backup and an ambulance, then carefully approached the scene with his hand on his weapon, not knowing what he might find. As he got closer, shining his flashlight on the woman's face, her eyes suddenly opened, and she looked at him with a confused, dazed expression. Marcus nearly jumped out of his skin. He had been certain she was dead. The woman tried to speak, but her words were slurred, barely comprehensible. Marcus helped her sit up and noticed the strong smell of alcohol emanating from her. His radio crackled as other officers arrived on the scene, and within minutes, they had pieced together what had happened. ***, but perhaps the most chilling highway encounters in American history didn't happen in modern times, with dash cams and cell phones to document them, but decades earlier, when incidents could only be pieced together through witness testimony and police reports. In 1946, in the border region between Texas and Arkansas, a series of attacks occurred that would become one of the most notorious. Unsolved cases in American criminal history. The case of the Texarkana Phantom Killer. On the night of February 26, 1946, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his girlfriend Mary Jean Larry were returning home to Texarkana after watching a movie at the local theater. It was a clear, cold night, and as they approached the city limits, Jimmy decided to pull off onto a secluded Lover's Lane road to spend a few more moments together. Before heading home, this was common practice for young couples in the 1940s. Quiet, dark roads where they could have privacy and talk without interruption. Neither of them had any idea that this innocent decision would nearly cost them their lives and mark the beginning of a terror that would grip the region for months. About 10 minutes after they had parked, Jimmy noticed movement in his rearview mirror. A figure emerged from the tree line and began walking toward their car with slow, deliberate steps. As the figure got closer, Jimmy's heart began to race. The person was wearing a white pillowcase over their head, with 2 rough holes cut out for eyes, like a child's ghost costume, but far more sinister. On a dark, isolated road at night, the masked man approached the driver's side window and tapped on the glass. Jimmy realized the object in his hand was a handgun. "Get out of the car," the man said, in a calm, almost conversational tone. "I don't want to kill you, fella. Just do what I say." Jimmy hesitated, still hoping it might be a prank by friends trying to scare them. That hesitation nearly cost him everything. The masked man raised his weapon and pointed it directly at Jimmy's face through the window. "Now," the man said, and this time there was no mistaking the deadly seriousness in his voice. Asterisk, asterisk. Jimmy slowly opened the car door and stepped out, his hands raised in surrender. The moment his feet touched the ground, the masked man swung his pistol like a club, striking Jimmy hard across the side of his head. The blow sent Jimmy sprawling, consciousness flickering in and out like a faulty light bulb through the haze of pain and confusion. Jimmy could hear Mary Jean screaming inside the car. He tried to get up, to help her, to do something, but his body wouldn't respond properly. The world was spinning, and warm blood ran down the side of his face. Mary Jean, seeing what had happened to Jimmy, made a desperate decision. She threw open the passenger door and ran, her heels clicking on the pavement as she sprinted toward the tree line, hoping the darkness would hide her. But the masked man was faster. He caught up to her within seconds and struck her with the same brutal efficiency he had used on Jimmy. Mary Jean collapsed to the ground, and for a moment, the masked man stood over her, breathing heavily. Jimmy, despite his injuries, managed to pull himself to his knees, trying to see what was happening. Then, suddenly, headlights appeared on the main road nearby, The masked man's head snapped toward the approaching vehicle, and without another word, he turned and ran back into the woods, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Mary Jean, dazed and injured, managed to get to her feet, stumbling toward the nearest house, pounding on the door, screaming for help. The residents, terrified by the blood-covered woman on their doorstep, immediately called the police. Meanwhile, Jimmy had managed to flag down a passing car that had inadvertently saved their lives. When police arrived, they found both victims with serious head injuries, but alive. Jimmy was rushed to the hospital, where doctors discovered his skull had been fractured in multiple places. It would take months of recovery, but he would survive. As both victims gave their statements to police, investigators noticed something odd. Jimmy and Mary Jean agreed on almost every detail of the attack. The white mask, the approximate height and build of the attacker, the weapon used, but they could not agree on one crucial detail: the attacker's race. Jimmy insisted the man was white, while Mary Jean was certain he was black. This discrepancy troubled investigators, and combined with the seemingly random nature of the attack, led some to incorrectly suspect that the victims knew their attacker and were trying to protect him by providing conflicting descriptions. What investigators didn't realize at the time was that Jimmy and Mary Jean were the lucky ones. Their survival meant they could tell their story, warn others, help police try to identify their attacker. The next victims wouldn't have that chance. On March 24th, 1946, less than a month after the attack on Jimmy and Mary Jean, a salesman named Tillman Johnson was driving along Richmond Road. On the outskirts of Texarkana, he noticed a car parked on the side of the road in an odd position. As he got closer, he saw what appeared to be a young man slumped over the steering wheel, possibly asleep, or maybe having car trouble. Tillman, being a good Samaritan, decided to stop and check if the person needed help. He parked his own car and walked over to the vehicle, calling out to see if anyone was inside. When he got no response, he approached the driver's side window and looked in. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The young man wasn't sleeping. He hadn't broken down. He was dead, shot multiple times, his body still warm to the touch, meaning this had happened very recently. But that wasn't all. In the back seat was a young woman, also deceased, also shot. Blood was everywhere inside the vehicle, and Tillman, a World War I veteran who had seen his share of death, still found himself overwhelmed by the scene. He ran back to his car and drove at top speed to the nearest police station. Within the hour, the scene was swarming with local police, Texas Rangers, and even FBI agents who happened to be in the area. The victims were identified as Richard Griffin, 29, and Polly and Moore, 17, a young couple on a date the night before they had last been seen, leaving a dance at the VFW hall around midnight. Based on the evidence, investigators determined they had driven to this secluded spot to spend some time together. When they were ambushed, Richard had been shot twice, in the back of the head, execution style. Polly and had been found in the back seat, also shot in the head, suggesting she had tried to hide or escape before being killed. The killer had used a .32 caliber weapon, and investigators found a single shell casing on the ground near the car. But beyond that one piece of physical evidence, there was nothing else. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no apparent motive. The crime scene was clean, professional, suggesting this wasn't the work of a panicked amateur, but rather someone who had done this before or had meticulously planned it. Asterisk, asterisk. News of the double murder spread through Texarkana like wildfire. Suddenly, people began connecting the dots. The attack on Jimmy and Mary Jean hadn't been an isolated incident or a simple robbery gone wrong. There was someone out there targeting young couples on secluded roads. And now, they had graduated from assault to murder. The entire region went into a state of panic. Hardware stores sold out of locks and deadbolts within days. Gun stores couldn't keep weapons in stock. Young couples, who had routinely spent time on quiet country roads, now avoided them entirely. Parents enforced strict curfews. The Texarkana Gazette was running daily updates on the investigation, and the headlines grew increasingly desperate. Phantom killer still at large. Police intensify search for madman. Texarkana lives in fear. But the killer wasn't finished. On April 14th, 1946, just 3 weeks after the murder of Richard and Polly, and the phantom struck again. This time the victims were Paul Martin, 16, and Betty Jo Booker, 15, two high school students. On their way home from a party, their bodies were found on a farm road about 3 miles outside of town. Both had been shot multiple times with the same .32 caliber weapon used in the previous murders. Betty Jo's saxophone was found near the scene. She had been carrying it home from the party where she had performed. The instrument became a poignant symbol of the innocents destroyed by these senseless killings. By now, the FBI had taken over the investigation, bringing in their best agents and the latest forensic technology available in 1946. More than 400 suspects were interviewed. Hundreds of tips came in daily from frightened residents. Police set up roadblocks and checkpoints throughout the area. Texas Rangers patrolled the highways in unmarked cars, hoping to catch the killer in the act. But despite all these efforts, the Phantom remained frustratingly elusive. He seemed to know exactly when and where to strike, always choosing moments when he wouldn't be seen. always managing to leave the scene before anyone could arrive. And then, investigators noticed something that would eventually crack the case, or at least point them toward a prime suspect. After months of investigation, detectives noticed a pattern they had initially missed. In the days before each attack, a vehicle had been reported stolen from somewhere in the Texarkana area, and in each case, the stolen vehicle was found abandoned shortly after the attack, usually within a few miles of the crime scene. This suggested that the killer was either someone who didn't own a car or someone deliberately using stolen vehicles to avoid leaving a trail back to themselves. Following this lead, investigators focused on known car thieves in the area. One name kept coming up: Yowl Swinney, a 29-year-old drifter and career criminal with 2 prior felony convictions for car theft. Swinney was exactly 6 feet tall, with a slender build matching the description that Jimmy and Mary Jean had given of their attacker. More importantly, Swinney had no solid alibis for any of the nights when the attacks occurred. When police finally arrested him in July 1946 for yet another car theft, his 3rd felony, something strange happened during the interrogation. As the officer read him his rights, Swinney said something that made everyone in the room go silent. "I know you boys want me for more than just stealing cars." The detective immediately seized on this statement. "What do you mean by that, Yowl?" he asked. Swinney's face went pale, and he clammed up, refusing to say another word. Without a lawyer present, his wife, Peggy Swinney, was also brought in for questioning. During a marathon interrogation session that lasted nearly 14 hours, she broke down and confessed that Yowl had told her details about the murders that only the killer would know. She described how he would come home late at night with blood on his clothes, how he would wake up screaming from nightmares, how he had once shown her the .32 caliber pistol he kept hidden in their house. Her testimony was damning, detailed, providing investigators with information about the crimes that had never been released to the public. But there was a problem, a big one. Under Texas law at the time, a wife could not be compelled to testify against her husband in court. And without her testimony, all the evidence against Yowl Swinney was circumstantial. The police had no physical evidence linking him to the murders, no fingerprints, no weapon. The gun Peggy described was never found. No witnesses. Prosecutors knew they couldn't get a murder conviction with what they had, but they could keep him off the streets. Using his 2 prior felony convictions, they charged him with his 3rd car theft and successfully argued for the maximum sentence. Under the habitual criminal statute, life in prison, Yowl Swinney was sent to the Texas State Penitentiary, where he would remain for the rest of his life, dying in 1994 at the age of 77. never having been formally charged. With the phantom murders, ***,